A Town Like Alice wasn't just Rank Organization's most emotionally devastating film of 1956, it was a love story built on a misunderstanding, starring a man whose own parentage was a secret he would not discover until his 40s. Directed by a man using a second cast in a second country to fake a geography that was being simultaneously recreated in a frozen pond in Buckinghamshire. So, let's dig into the wreckage of A Town Like Alice with 15 facts, the studio, the censors, and the diplomatic establishment all tried to bury, including the real man who inspired the crucifixion scene, the Japanese film festival diplomacy that left one of its stars incandescent with rage, and the reason the United States of America got a completely different, far more aggressive title than everyone else. The foundation of A Town Like Alice, the emotional bedrock of everything the film tries to do, is a misunderstanding. Nevil Shute based the novel's central narrative, the forced march of women and children across occupied Malaya, on a story he heard during a visit to Sumatra in 1949. He met Carrie Geisel, a Dutch woman who had been one of approximately 80 civilian prisoners taken by Japanese forces at Padang in the Dutch East Indies in 1942. Shute understood from their conversations that Geisel and her fellow prisoners had been forced to march across Sumatra for 2.5 years, covering some 1,900 kilometers with fewer than 30 people surviving. The Nevil Shute Norway Foundation, the custodial body of Shute's literary legacy, states plainly that this was not what happened. The women were not forced to walk. They were transported between prison camps by the Japanese. The phrase the Foundation uses to describe Shute's error is one of the more remarkable assessments in the history of literary sources. Shute, fortunately misinformed about parts of her experience, mistakenly understands that the women were made to walk. This was possibly the luckiest misunderstanding of his life. The death march that became the moral and physical heart of one of the most beloved British novels of the 20th century, and subsequently of the 1956 film, was a fiction produced by failure of communication between a novelist and his source. What was actually endured was terrible enough. What Shute imagined from his misreading of that experience produced something that has outlasted both. The man who built this misunderstanding into a novel was not, professionally speaking, Nevil Shute. His full name was Nevil Shute Norway. He published his fiction as Nevil Shute, dropping his family surname entirely, because he was simultaneously pursuing a career as a serious aeronautical engineer, and he feared that his employers and professional colleagues would conclude, on discovering he wrote novels, that he was not a serious person. The pen name was a protective shield between his professional identity and his creative one, maintained for decades across both careers. This is peculiar enough in its own right, but the specific trajectory of Shute's engineering career gives it a darker resonance. He worked as chief calculator on the R-100 airship project under Barnes-Wallis at Vickers. He watched as the R-100 Noe, the privately developed airship, made a successful transatlantic round trip to Canada, while its government-developed counterpart, the R-101, was pushed forward by political pressure over engineering objections. The R-101 crashed in France in October 1930, killing 48 people, including the Secretary of State for Air. Shute's own account, in his 1954 autobiography, Slide Rule, strongly implies that senior team members concealed structural flaws in the R-101's design, and that political urgency drove the fatal flight. He spent years professionally adjacent to a governmental cover-up of engineering incompetence that resulted in mass death. He then left England, partly because British taxation was crushing him, and partly, he wrote, because he believed that post-war British socialism was destroying the national character. He died in Australia in 1960, 5 days before his 61st birthday. The man who wrote A Town Like Alice under a false name, having built it from a misunderstood conversation with a Dutch prisoner of war, was also the man who had watched a government kill 48 people by ignoring engineers, and spent the rest of his life writing novels about private enterprise and individual moral courage under the name he chose for himself rather than the one he was born with. The character of Joe Harmon, the Australian stockman who steals chickens to feed the dying women, is caught by the Japanese and is crucified and beaten while the prisoners are forced to watch, was based on a real man. Herbert James Ringer Edwards was an Australian private in the 226th Battalion, captured with the fall of Singapore in February 1942. Shute met him in 1948 on a cattle station in Queensland. Edwards had survived the Burma-Thailand Railway as a prisoner of forced labor. In 1943, he and 2 fellow prisoners slaughtered cattle to provide meat for themselves and their starving comrades. The details of what followed constitute one of the most extreme survival stories documented in the Pacific theater. Edwards was bound to a tree with fencing wire, beaten relentlessly with a baseball bat. At one point, he managed to free his right hand, at which point his captors drove the wire through the palm of his hand to restrain it. He hung there for 63 hours. He survived. But the horror did not stop there. According to the records, Edwards was later sentenced to execution. The order could not be carried out at the scheduled time because his requested last meal, chicken and beer, could not be obtained. By the time it could be procured, the operational moment had passed and Edwards lived. Shute incorporated both of these events into A Town Like Alice, the crucifixion in the Malayan jungle and the chicken that triggered it. Edwards returned to Western Australia after the war, worked on cattle stations, and died in 2000 at the age of 86. When Virginia McKenna's Jean Paget watches Joe Harmon being nailed to a tree on screen, she is watching a dramatization of something that actually happened to a man who was still alive when the film premiered. Peter Finch came to A Town Like Alice as one of Rank Organization's most carefully curated investments, a man they intended to make into a major British star, under a 7-year contract worth £87,500, cast in a war drama that would require him to project both physical ease and moral courage as an Australian POW in the Malayan jungle. His background for the role was impeccable. He had been born in London, emigrated to Sydney as a child, worked in Australian vaudeville and radio, served with the Australian Army during the Second World War, and been discovered by Laurence Olivier in 1948 during the Old Vics Australian tour. He was, in every public biographical sense, the perfect Australian. But here is the dark detail that Finch would not discover until he was in his mid-40s. The man he believed to be his father, George Ingle Finch, a distinguished Australian-born chemist and mountaineer who had been part of the 1922 Everest expedition, was not his biological father. George Finch had divorced Peter's mother Alicia in 1920 on the grounds of her adultery with Wentworth. Edward Dallas Jock Campbell, a Scottish Army officer. Peter was 2 years old when the divorce happened. His mother subsequently married Campbell. Peter was raised by his paternal grandmother in France, then moved to India, then emigrated to Australia. He did not meet his biological mother until he was 33. He did not learn the identity of his biological father until he was in his mid-40s, after A Town Like Alice had already made him a star. The man the British press celebrated as the quintessential Australian was the secret son of a Scottish Highland officer, raised by a French grandmother who discovered the truth of his own origin only after he had become famous for playing people whose identity he understood completely. 2 years before A Town Like Alice, Peter Finch had survived one of the most chaotic productions in post-war British cinema, Elephant Walk, shot partly in Ceylon in 1954. The film's original leading lady was Vivien Leigh, by then married to Laurence Olivier, who had signed Finch to his personal management contract years earlier. The affair between Finch and Leigh, which had begun in 1948 during the Old Vics Australian tour, continued intermittently for years. On the set of Elephant Walk, in the heat of Ceylon, with Olivier in Italy and Unreachable, Leigh suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She was filmed battering at aircraft windows as the production relocated to Hollywood. She was eventually replaced by Elizabeth Taylor. Finch's first marriage to Romanian-born ballerina Tamara Chinarova did not end until 1959, when Chinarova discovered the details of the Lay affair in California. Olivier's marriage to Leigh survived for years longer, but never recovered its equilibrium. Finch's subsequent IMDb biography records that several biographies chronicle the affairs and the booze, but a serious appraisal of a great actor remains to be written. He arrived on A Town Like Alice as one of British cinema's most charming and most personally catastrophic presences, a man whose professional trajectory was rising precisely as his private life was quietly unraveling. Now, what makes the central war sequences of A Town Like Alice so remarkable, the images of women and children trudging through jungle and swamp, covered in grime and exhaustion, their numbers dwindling, is that almost none of them were filmed anywhere near Malaya. Director Jack Lee flew to Singapore and Malaya early in pre-production, scouted the locations, and devised a method. He would cast a second group of actors in Malaya who matched the clothing and physical bearing of his principal British cast, film them on location, and then cut between the Malayan footage and the corresponding scenes shot at Pinewood Studios in England. The result would create the impression of continuous geography. The swamp sequences, the scenes that most viscerally convey the physical suffering of the death march, the women wading through humid, Knee-deep water in the tropical heat were filmed in a pond in Burnham Beaches, a woodland area in Buckinghamshire, a few miles from Pinewood. Virginia McKenna described the experience directly. In her own words, "We actually plodded through a pond in Burnham Beaches. It was freezing cold, so they were spraying glycerin on our faces to make it seem swelteringly hot." The film's most harrowing images of women destroyed by tropical heat and physical degradation were produced by actresses wading through icy English water in autumn or winter, with artificial sweat applied from spray bottles. The cold ponds of Buckinghamshire produced the humid swamps of occupied Malaya. The BAFTA-winning performances of authentic wartime suffering were delivered partly in conditions of theatrical fiction while shivering in the English countryside. Jean Paget, the character Virginia McKenna plays with such concentrated emotional authority, was not originally intended for McKenna. In December 1954, before the production had fully taken shape, Rank Organization announced that they hoped Olivia de Havilland would play the lead alongside Peter Finch. De Havilland was at that point one of Hollywood's most distinguished leading actresses, a two-time Academy Award winner for To Each His Own and The Heiress, and a figure of genuine international prestige whose name attached to the project would have guaranteed a different kind of commercial and critical conversation. The announcement named her as the hoped-for lead explicitly. She did not take the role. The production record does not detail why the plan changed. What is documented is that when Jack Lee came aboard as director, he turned to Virginia McKenna, a younger, less internationally established actress who had appeared in several well-regarded British films but was not carrying de Havilland's global marquee value. The BAFTA that McKenna won for the role she was apparently not the first choice to play remains one of the more satisfying ironies in the film's history. There is one more name that appears in the casting history of A Town Like Alice that deserves examination. Anna Kashfi screen-tested for a small role and was cast. She then had to turn it down to fulfill a commitment on another film. In 1957, Anna Kashfi became Marlon Brando's first wife. Their marriage lasted 2 years and produced a son, Christian Brando, whose own life would become one of Hollywood's most tragic biographical footnotes. The Anna Kashfi, who nearly appeared in A Town Like Alice in a small, uncredited capacity, was on the verge of a personal history that would become far more newsworthy than any film credit could have made her. The role she vacated has no record of who ultimately filled it. The most striking piece of casting in A Town Like Alice is the Japanese captain, played by Kenji Takaki, with a quality of quiet menace that the film deploys carefully. Never fully dehumanizing, never fully explaining. Takaki was not a professional actor. He was discovered in London and was offered the role substantially on the basis of his geographic proximity to the production. The film was being made at Pinewood, the casting was being done in England, and finding a Japanese actor willing to play an Imperial Army officer in a British war film set during the Japanese occupation of Malaya presented specific challenges. Takaki had served in the Merchant Navy during the Second World War. After completing his scenes in A Town Like Alice, he disappeared from the professional acting record entirely. He made Lampshades, the man whose face appears in one of the most morally charged sequences in 1950s British cinema, presiding over a crucifixion, forcing women and children to watch, return to ordinary life without apparent subsequent engagement with the industry that had briefly borrowed his face. A Town Like Alice was entered into the 1956 Cannes Film Festival. It was then withdrawn. The reason given was that the film's depiction of Japanese war crimes, the forced march, the deaths, the crucifixion, might offend the Japanese government at a moment when Western diplomatic and commercial relationships with Japan were actively being cultivated as Cold War priorities. The political logic was straightforward. Japan was being rehabilitated as a Western ally, Japanese sensitivities needed management, and a British film showing Japanese soldiers crucifying an Australian prisoner while forcing women and children to watch was not the diplomatic instrument the moment required. Peter Finch's response, delivered publicly, was the angriest recorded statement he ever made about the film industry. He called film festivals a film-selling racket which offers the chance for vulgar display and reckless extravagance. He stated that they serve no cultural purpose and that their awards don't mean a thing. He subsequently told a Melbourne newspaper that he had a burning ambition to make a very funny movie about the Cannes Film Festival. The film that was withdrawn from Cannes to avoid offending Japan went on to win BAFTA awards for both its leads, Finch for Best British Actor, McKenna for Best British Actress, and became the third most popular film at the British box office for the entire year of 1956. The diplomatic calculation that kept it out of competition at Cannes did not prevent it from becoming one of the most commercially and critically successful British films of its decade. When A Town Like Alice was eventually released in the United States of America in 1958, 2 years after its United Kingdom premiere, it was released under a different name. The American title was The Rape of Malaya. The word rape appears in the title not in its contemporary most common usage, but in the older English sense, meaning violent seizure or conquest, the despoiling of a territory by force. This usage was legitimate, defensible, and historically grounded. It was also jarring in a way that the British distributors clearly felt the American market would either find more dramatically compelling or more commercially potent. The German release was retitled Marsch durch die Hölle, March Through Hell, a film carefully calibrated in its British version to maintain measured restraint, to show atrocity without exploitation, was being marketed in its international versions with titles that deliberately sharpened the provocative edges, the original title deliberately smoothed. The screenplay for A Town Like Alice, written by W.P. Lipscomb, adapted only the first half of Nevil Shute's novel. The second half, in which Jean Piaget uses her inheritance to transform a desolate Queensland outback settlement called Willstown into a thriving community modeled on Alice Springs, building a shoe factory, establishing businesses, and systematically improving the lives of outback women, was entirely omitted. The film ends at the moment of Jean and Joe's reunion, which is where the love story achieves its emotional resolution. What Shute considered equally important, the entrepreneurial, social, and feminist project of Jean's Australian years, the part of the book that argues that individual resourcefulness and private enterprise can transform communities, was judged too quiet, too undramatic, and too narratively dispersed for a film that had already used its running time on the war material. The Australian town of Alice Springs was represented on screen by second unit footage shot locally with stand-ins for the principals. A local chemist named John Cummings stood in for Peter Finch, and a TAA hostess served as the stand-in for Virginia McKenna during the airport reunion sequence. When the film had its Australian premiere in Alice Springs itself, the locals who appeared in these background sequences recognized their own streets, shops, and neighbors, and the audience's response was described by one reporter as amused. The title of the film named a place that appeared for only a few minutes at the end of a story that never showed what the place actually meant in Shute's novel. The Australian premiere of A Town Like Alice was held in Alice Springs itself, described by Australian Women's Weekly at the time as a bush premiere. The event was informal by any standard that the film industry typically applied to major theatrical openings. Peter Finch arrived for the occasion and invited Beryl Oliver, the air hostess, on his flight to accompany him as his guest. The two sat together throughout the screening. During the intermission, Arunta, men and women from the Hermannsburg mission, wearing khaki riding pants and bright tartan check shirts, sang Lest We Forget and The Lord Has Ascended on High in their own language. The Argus newspaper, reporting on the evening, observed that Hollywood would have been horrified at the informality of the whole occasion. It was only in the final minutes of the screening that the people of Alice Springs got to see anything of their own town, and some of those who appeared in the background street scenes recognized themselves on screen and received, according to contemporary accounts, amused reactions from their neighbors. The film premiering in the town that named it, with the star's date being an airline employee, while Indigenous Australians sang traditional songs at intermission, while local residents spotted themselves in street scenes in which a different actress had been used as the principal's double. This was the event that launched in its country of partial inspiration a film that had been mostly shot in Buckinghamshire. The Joe Harmon of Nevil Shute's novel is a complete character. Crucified, yes, but also entrepreneurial, stubborn, and ultimately the catalyst for Jean's Australian transformation. The Joe Harmon of the 1956 film is an emotional presence, a symbol of Australian male decency and physical courage, who disappears after his crucifixion and reappears only for a reunion sequence at the film's end. Finch plays the character with enormous warmth and sardonic ease, and he earned his BAFTA fully. But the novel's Joe, the man who manages a cattle station, argues with Jean about the future of Willstown, falls in love across practical disagreements about economics and community building, never appears in the film at all. The screenplay gave Finch the war material and omitted the piece exactly as the title might suggest. A man whose real-life prototype had survived crucifixion and a botched execution was reduced in the second half of his fictional life to an airport reunion sequence filmed with a local chemist as his body double. When A Town Like Alice premiered in Britain in March 1956, it was received with warmth and considerable critical respect. Though some reviewers noted its reticence, the way the film pulled certain punches that the subject might have warranted. By year's end, it was the third most popular film at the British box office, outperformed by only two other productions. Its BAFTA sweep was genuine recognition of performances of real quality, and yet it was simultaneously being kept out of Cannes by diplomatic anxiety, retitled for American audiences who apparently needed a more violent prompt to attend, and quietly acknowledged by the Australian press as something that was British rather than Australian in its bones, despite the Australian names attached to it. The algorithm of history has been kind to the film in specific ways and honest about it in others. The 1980 Australian television miniseries 6 Hours with Helen Morse and Brian Brown, covering the entire novel, did what the film couldn't, giving the Australian chapters their proper weight and the character of Willstown the development that Shute considered central to his novel's meaning. The film survives as a document of what 1956 British cinema could and could not do with wartime atrocity. It could show the women trudging, could show the crucifixion, could show the deaths, but only if it also showed restraint, romance, and resolution. Virginia McKenna's performance is so precise and so concentrated that the film's limitations become almost irrelevant in the moments she is on screen. The frozen pond in Burnham Beaches produced something that felt true. So let me ask you the question the film itself never quite gets around to asking. A Town Like Alice is built from a misunderstanding, an author who got the core facts wrong and produced a better novel for it. It is filled with people operating under concealed identities, a writer who used a pen name, an actor who didn't know his own father, a Japanese lead who had no professional experience and returned to making lampshades, a second cast in a second country creating the impression of a geography that was simultaneously being recreated in cold English water. Is a film that performs its own geography, that makes Buckinghamshire look like Malaya through spray bottles and careful matching, more or less honest than a film that tries to film in the actual location and fails to capture it? And does the misunderstanding at the novel's origin, the march that wasn't quite a march, make the suffering it depicts less real? Or does it tell us something important about how fiction earns its authority from something other than fact?